Greetings, fellow humans. I'm MartianBuu, and today we're going to talk about 10 of the worst cards ever printed, and we're going to try to fix them for their time. So a couple of things. I'm not going to alter a card with modern mechanics that weren't around at the time. For example, Boogie Monster is on this list, and I'm not just going to give it Rush, because Rush wasn't around when Boogie Monster came out. The other thing is I'm not trying to make these cards broken, I'm trying to make them playable. I'm not just like reducing their mana like for today's time period to see play today. I'm evaluating them for their time and like, could they have seen play at the time if they were a little bit differently? So some of these are going to look a little bit like, well, that's still trash, but yes, because that's today's standards. All cards are trash. So with that, let's get into the first one, which is the infamous Dustfallen Aviana. And I think Dustfallen Aviana, a lot of people point out this card as being the singular worst card ever printed, but I actually think it doesn't deserve that, because once it got Maiev, it's not like there's nothing you can do with it. There are a lot of cards that there's nothing you can do with them, like War Golem. You could win a game with Dustfallen Aviana, pretty reasonably now that you have Maiev. So you play the Dustfallen Aviana on 9 and play Maiev to give it dormant, and then in 2 turns it comes online on your turn, so you get to use the 0 cost effect before your opponent's ever had a chance to. You play Malygos, you copy it or something and blow up your opponent. The problem with that is there's a more efficient way to do that. Once Druid got Maiev, it also had Kael'thas, and so Kael'thas combined with old Aviana and other stuff was a much better way to play Malygos, and that's the deck that saw play. But if Maiev had come out before Kael'thas, we'd have actually seen this card get played. Anyways, so that's the disclaimer for poor Aviana, who I think gets a worse rap than she deserves. But at the time, she was very, very bad. The problem with this card is that your opponent gets to benefit from it before you do. So you play it, your opponent gets to play a big thing for free, and then they kill the Aviana, and you never get to benefit from it. So you've basically paid 5 mana to advance your opponent's game plan. And so thinking about Maiev, my first thought that I was going to do to change this card was to give it dormant for 2 turns. But then I think it's broken. Like if you play this on 5 and then it has dormant for 2 turns, and then on 7 you get to play a free Malygos and just win, that's too good. So what I opted for was Battle Cry. On each player's next turn, the first card played costs 0. This way, your opponent still gets to do their 0 cost thing before you do and punish you for doing it, but then you're still guaranteed to get use out of the effect. I do think now that I'm looking at it, I really wish that I'd up the cost on it, because I think I actually think this on 5 is still too good with like Malygos. So you really want this to be up more towards 8 or 9. Definitely. This costs too little. I didn't actually think that far ahead. So yeah, you want this to cost a little bit more with that effect. Maybe even 10, I don't know, because that would be a lot stronger. But you are giving your opponent a free thing. So like if you're up against aggro, you're not really gonna care that you just gave your opponent a free card. But if you're up against like another combo deck, you just instantly lose. This needs to cost more than 5, but this is what I would do. Then we have Harbinger Celestia, which I think does deserve its reputation as possibly the worst card ever printed. This card is so awful. You pay your 4 mana to get your 5/6 stealth. Card is busted. But then your opponent gets to turn it into whatever. And that immediately unstealths it. So they play Novice Engineer and ping your Harvester Celestia or whatever. Your opponent gets to just unstealth this at will, and they get to turn it into whatever. It's really easy to remove, and your opponent has too much control over it. The change that I'm making to it is that it keeps the stealth. If your opponent plays nothing, you still get your 5/6, but they can't just play something cheap and kill it. They're pressured for the rest of the game to always have their most recent minion be something unimpactful. So do I think that this is going to be a tier 1 card with this change? No, but I think it's an interesting card that will cause your opponent to have to play around it awkwardly for the rest of the game. I think it would be cooler if it kept the stats too. I think this is just broken if it keeps the stats, right? 4 mana 5/6 with stealth, unless your opponent plays a minion. Isn't that just really good? Is it supposed to keep shifting because it doesn't do that currently? Oh my goodness, that tells you how often I've played this card. It only changes once? All right, so what this needs to say instead of keeping stealth then is keeps this effect. But how do you keep that in low lines of text? In pure text, it'd be whenever instead of after? This card is worse than I thought it was. I thought it kept shifting when you throw it and played cards. I didn't realize it was stuck on 1. This card is awful. But anyways, that's the type of thing that I want for it, but we might run into text problems. In post, I'm going to come up with a new text for this and put it on the screen. You guys can tell me if I did well or not. Moving on, Dr. Boom's Scheme, another infamous one. So this is 4 mana for gain 1 armor, and it upgrades each turn. So how much armor does this need to give you before it's actually good? That's the real question. And the answer is too much, right? Because if this is 10 armor, 4 for 10 armor is pretty good, right? At least for that time. Even for now, I think 4 mana for just flat 10 armor. Maybe that's borderline bad for now. But in Wild, you still get Shatter. I think that might see play. But that means it had to sit in your hand for 9 turns. Upgrade by 2 and it would see play at the time. Yeah, I think upgrade by 2 is better, but I think it can't cost 4 mana. I think it needs to go down. But anyways, I also think that for its time, gaining by 2 might have been too much. If you made this good enough, gaining by 2 and reducing its cost to 2, that would get you a lot of armor pretty quickly and be very cheap to play. If you could leave it in hand for 5 turns and for 2 mana, you're gaining 10 armor. That's pretty strong back then. So I do think that that might be borderline too much for its time, but maybe it would be okay. But this is what I went with. Gain 1 armor and summon 1/1/1 Boombot. Upgrades each turn. Part of what I've always hated about this card is that it doesn't show armor gain on the card. It's not very thematic with Dr. Boom or with the picture that it has. I really like it having some kind of explosive effect attached to it. And Dr. Boom summons Boombots. That's part of his thing. And he's making explosions. I've heard that the original design for this card was to shuffle bombs into your opponent's deck. I could see how that might have been a little bit too much. Even if it's sat in your hand for 2 turns, 4 mana for shuffle 3 bombs into your opponent's deck, I could see how that might not have been a play pattern that they wanted to encourage. Obviously, for today's standards, that's totally fine. But I think at the time, something more like this would have been pretty playable. Really, I feel like that would have been a blast. Then we have Milhouse Monostorm. Milhouse Monostorm is somewhat, I don't want to say somewhat of a decent card, but like it was good enough to see Fringe play, because in Classic, you could just drop him on 2, and most of the decks back then couldn't really punish you for doing that, but they still could. It wasn't as reliable as it would be today, but they still could punish you for it, and that's if you dropped it on 2. If you had it any later, it would be awful. While trying to keep the enemy spells cost 0 next turn effect, and also incorporate the just wait till I get 10 mana, I was thinking about like, what could this do if it was played later? And I think adding this effect at 10 mana was not good enough. But what I went with is if you have less than 6 mana, enemy spells cost 0 next turn. So that way, if you have it early, it's as good as it was when it saw Fringe play. You play it on 2 for the risk of your opponent has the spells they need to punish you for doing that. But if you draw it later, it's not unplayable, because once you hit 6 mana, you can play an efficient 2 for 4/4 and also play something else alongside it. And it runs along the theme of just wait till I get 10 mana. I feel like it's not a change worth making if you make it actually 10 mana. Could change the wording to have Mana Thirst. I'm changing these for their time. So Mana Thirst didn't exist back then. Then we have Gruul. The problem with Gruul, even though it is a lot of stats for the cost, so by the time it comes back to your turn, it's an 8 for 9/9, right? Which is pretty good, and then it keeps getting bigger. But it is just kind of a giant pile of stats that doesn't do anything, and it's very big game hunterable. How do you fix this while keeping its effect on it? What I went with is Taunt. Immediate board impact. So you can actually drop this against an aggro deck on 8 and it'll do something for you. Is it going to be an amazing card like that? Probably not. You could consider putting +2/+2 on this, but then I think the card is maybe just polarizing. You could lower the cost down, but I feel like it's the type of effect that you don't really want to be too good for back in the day. Ironbark Defender, yes, but legendary and better than that. You could 7 mana it. I think we're thinking of this by today's standards, which is what makes us want to lower that cost even more. But in Classic, the tools to deal with this are actually a lot harder. You basically had Big Game Hunter and Siphon Soul, and Siphon Soul cost 6. So Warrior had a couple of good removal tools, but you know, a giant taunt that gets bigger and bigger ends the game against certain things. So I do think this probably doesn't still see meta play with this, but it's not like outright terrible. I think Ironbark with upside is a reasonable legendary for Classic, yeah. Then we have Temporus. So Temporus is iconically awful because it's basically 7 mana, lose the game. Giving your opponent 2 turns in a row is really strong. If you're up against an aggro deck, they just burst you down. And if you're up against a like control combo or just combo deck, they use those 2 turns to set up whatever their plan is to end the game and just kill you. I think this effect has been done better, like Zarimi, especially the newer Zarimi that requires more stuff, I think is a better this type of effect. Instead of giving your opponent the tools to ruin you, it just requires a little bit more effort to set up your extra turn kill. But we're keeping with the spirit of the card, so you have to give your opponent 2 turns before you get to take your 2 turns. And what I thought was the decent compromise is to make it Reno. So if you're up against aggro, they have 2 turns in a row later in the game to blow you up. And if you're up against control combo, they probably just beat you anyway. So I don't think this is that much better. However, I could definitely see fully healing your hero being too strong for this time period without, you know, like the side effect. So I could see this going up a mana or 2, but I'm really not that worried about it. Giving your opponent 2 turns is super devastating. This means that occasionally you will survive because you're not playing this with 13 health left against aggro. I think at this time aggro paladin was killing you before 7, so this isn't a problem. Seems OP with the card they're printing next year with Battlecry. Only read the first sentence of every card for the rest of the game. Exactly. Then we have the Boogie monster. So as I said before, what I really wanted to do with this was just give it Rush. The problem is Rush wasn't out yet, so couldn't just give it Rush. And also Charge with Battlecry can't attack heroes this turn was also not out yet. So I couldn't even use Pseudo Charge. They hadn't experimented with Pseudo Charge yet. What I went with is whenever this attacks and kills a minion, gain +2/+2, but it also attacks an enemy minion at the end of each turn. Worst Lothar? Yeah, but Lothar wasn't out yet. I don't know that this is worst Lothar. This is attacks an enemy minion at the end of each turn. So it's attacking at the end of your turn, and then if it survives, it's attacking at the end of your opponent's turn. So it's pretty easy, I think, to go 2 for 1 with this thing. Do I think it's great? No, I don't think it's great still, even with this, but I think it's much more playable. It has immediate board impact, which is the biggest problem with the card. And since we can't use Rush yet, I think this is a decent way to make it interesting. Then we have Surrender to Madness, which I think is maybe the worst card ever. Like, look how bad this thing is. You do This is 3 mana lose the game right here. I don't know. It's so awful. I'm just going to skip right to what I did. So what I went with is give all minions in your hand and deck +2/+2. All right. So it is affecting your hand immediately. And I also had to draw 3 cards because I think, especially at the time, destroy 3 mana crystals was that devastating of an effect. If you can play this and go 3 mana crystals down, you should have a pretty significant payoff for that. When I was first putting the new one together, I went with hand, deck, and battlefield, and I thought about it and I was like, this is just giving Savage Roar to Priest, right? So I do think that it's important that it not affect the things that are already out. So this way, it buffs everything that's sitting in your hand, and it buffs everything that's in your deck, and it gives you a bunch of gas. So you are going to have things that have benefit from the buff. I do think destroying 3 of your mana crystals is still too much of a downside. Like, I can't imagine how you would build your priest deck to take advantage of this and reliably not lose immediately. Cute priest? Yeah, pretty much. Like, if if you were running an aggro priest, you had like the whole suite of 0 cost minions that were available. What was this? Was this Rosticons Rumble? So we had Target Dummy, Wisp, Tiny Fin. We had Penguin, right? So there was some stuff we could play with this. And you had like Shadow Bomber and stuff. So you could do like an aggro priest. Then we have Bolvar Fireblood, which is 5 mana for a 1/7. Whenever a friendly minion dies while this is in your hand, gain +1 attack. And I was thinking hand and deck, but then this is always just going to be like a 5 mana 7/7, which is maybe fine. Maybe that's good enough. But what I went with instead is whenever a minion dies while this is in your hand, +1 attack. So much more like Corridor Creeper. I think having it scale up is good, and just being a big beefy stick on 5 or at least 4/5 is really good as far as like wanting to play this card. It just needs to scale faster. It scales way too slow if it's just friendly minions. But this way you can trade minions in an aggro deck. You can clear minions in a slower deck. It's just much more flexible. Give it charge. Yeah, exactly. Then we have Furnacefire Colossus. So 6 mana, 6/6, discard all weapons from your hand and gain their stats. So this one was asking you to put too many weapons in your deck and then draw them and then discard them, which is a pretty tough ask. And the payoff for that is a giant thing that's like Shadow Word Deathable. What set is this from? This is from Wrath of the Lich King. But yeah, it does have the wrong symbol on it. That's weird. Yeah, Frozen Throne. Yeah. Wrath of the Lich King was the WoW set, or WoW expansion. So I wanted to make the effect more of a payoff. So I went with discard all weapons from your hand, gain their stats, and deal their attack to all other minions. That way, it's a board clear in addition to being a stat bomb, but also you can get value out of it without having to put too many weapons in your deck. So like, even if you were just playing Fiery War Axe, having 6 mana 6/6 deal 3 damage to all other minions is pretty good, right? So then you're probably running like Death Spite and stuff like that too. 6 mana 9/8. Oh, okay, did I say it wrong? My bad. Pretty big swinging, honestly. You know what? It might need to have a higher cost and its stats might need to start a little bit lower. So that is fair. That is fair. But I would rather it be like an exciting card to fit into decks that don't have to overload weapons. Like, I don't want half your cards to have to be weapons for this to be good. What would I do? 7 mana 4/4? 7 mana 4/4, but you have to go down a card in hand? Warrior Draw was historically bad back then. You guys have to remember that part. Like, they had Acolyte of Pain and that was it. So like, discarding a card in Warrior, and especially discarding multiple cards, is a problem. Oh, you know what? I was actually only thinking about this in the context of Warrior. This goes in other things with that cost. What else would you play it in? True Silver Champion. That was their only good weapon, right? Was Forge of Souls in the set? Yep. But it wasn't in the set and played. So like, this would give you a reason to play that. Silver Sword. Oh, I guess they had like the they had the Cleaver, right? So yeah, this thing needs to go down in stats. I was thinking about it as a warrior card. Talking it through, maybe it does need to be like a 7 mana 4/4 at this point, considering it's neutral and can go in everything. Maybe even a 7 mana 3/3. But I still like this a lot better. I think it's pretty cool. Draw was much more premium back then. Doesn't rely on having a bunch of weapons, and removal, this thing would die. Most of the time it would die, right? Could we make it discard 1 weapon? If we make it discard a weapon, I feel like we're infringing on changing the spirit of the card. Assuming we can, discard a weapon from your hand so you have less control over what gets discarded. I think we still need to lower the stats, but can it be a 6 cost still at that point? Seems fair as a 6 mana 6/6, to be honest. We're talking about it for its time. I think today it could be a 6 mana 6/6, but this is like when it came out in Frozen Throne. We're trying to design it. Is this thing play outside of Warrior at the time? Probably in Paladin. But like, Control Paladin needed the help. Also, this is the set where Fiery War Axe got nerfed. So you've basically just got Death Spite in Warrior. I don't know. It's hard to say. This is where it gets a little tougher because like, I don't have the back end. Like, if I was designing cards on their side of things, I get to like try it out and see how good it is in decks, right? You get to test it a little bit behind the scenes and see how good it is. You have to get a weapon. You have to discard that weapon, and it clears your own stuff too. So like, when I first typed it out, I actually went back. I read it and thought, this is a one-sided board clear. I went back and I changed it to other so that it would nuke your own side of the board as well. Was Charge nerfed during this time? I actually don't remember. I think so. If discard all weapons from your hands and gain their stats plus Charge was a good deck, it would have been good without this effect change, right? Like, it gets the bonus of getting to go through taunts with this, but I don't think that would have stopped it from being a deck. Anyways. Oh, that was all of them. That was the last one. How long was that? That was actually a lot shorter than I was expecting it to be. I didn't talk about these nearly as long as I was thinking I would. So this might end up being a short video. Should I say something to sign off? It's kind of an abrupt end. All right, well, that's all of them. Goodbye forever. What would I do to the beast? What would I do to the beast? I just wouldn't make him. Bro's giving up. Give the beast Charge. That'd be so strong. Well, isn't it a 9/6? I wonder if you could have the beast give Fizzle Butt to a random player, like make it 50%. Sometimes it'll end up on the enemy board, sometimes it'll end up on your board. Oh, it's a 6 mana 9/7 even? Yeah, that can't have Charge. That 1 health makes the difference. No, just kidding. Make it you spawn a 3/3 as well. The reason I think you can't do that is because it's a lore specific card. The Fizzle, whatever his name is. What's that guy's name? It was like from a quest in Hyjal, I think, is when he like takes you to go see the beast and stuff. It's Pip Quickwit now. All right, I forget the name of the actual. Like I know they changed it for some reference. Pit was a little clumsy, right? So they can make it like Death Rattle. A player gets a 3/3. That sounds like something they could have done in Classic. Sometimes you get a 6 mana 9/7 that gives you a 3/3. The other half of the time you give your opponent a 3/3. That would have been good enough, wouldn't it? If half the time you got the 3/3. A lot of people would have hated that though.